last summer, Venezuela applied for an IMF loan. It was a small loan, something like $20 million, to allow it to buy medical supplies because the pandemic had begun and they were locking down their population. And of course, the IMF said no. It was difficult to understand why. And we've seen this same rejection applied to Iran. However, in early 2015, I believe it was February, Joe Biden went to Kiev. It was his first trip to Kiev as the kind of imperial lord of the post-Maidan order. And he boasted that he had secured an IMF, a gigantic IMF loan, billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is a country that already at that point was notorious for corruption, ranked as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And that loan money went straight to Swiss banks through the pockets of the few, 10 or 11 sweaty oligarchs that controlled the country. So how do you explain this? You've written that the IMF is basically a small room in the Pentagon's basement. So how do you explain this disparity in treatment between countries like Ukraine, which are absolutely incapable of paying back these loans, are so notoriously corrupt, and countries like Venezuela and Iran, which are obviously targets of U.S. empire?
Well, my book, Super Imperialism, is all about how the IMF was created as an arm of U.S. foreign policy. And it still is an arm. And there's a mentality that the IMF has of it's a pro-creditor mentality. And it's dominated thoroughly by the United States and in a Cold War modality. That's why Russia and China are seeking to create their own international bank. And the even more vicious arm of American imperialism, probably the most deadly, is the World Bank, which is enormously destructive throughout the former Soviet Union and the Third World by pushing microcurrency loans that are aimed at essentially making loans to women as heads of families, 70%, 80%, and then breaking up the family, foreclosing on them, essentially using microcredit loans as a way of evicting masses of families from their property and turning it over to the client oligarchies in these countries, and in blocking countries from developing their own food self-sufficiency in grain, making them dependent on U.S. Grain exports. That's been a central aim of the World Bank ever since its inception, fighting against land reform. So the World Bank and the IMF have always been probably the most viciously pro-rentier, anti-progressive institutions in the world. And as such, they're guided by essentially the America's deep state as an arm of subjugating other countries, preventing their self-sufficiency. The idea is if you can impoverish them, you will somehow lead to a regime change and put in a client oligarchy that will be willing to make their economy dependent on the United States. That's U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell since 1945.
Yeah, Professor Hudson, related to Venezuela, we were talking about the impacts of sanctions, and there's a de facto blockade of Venezuela. A Venezuelan economist, left-wing economist named Pascalina Curcio, recently wrote an article in a Venezuelan media outlet in which she estimated that $350 billion of Venezuelan assets have been stolen or frozen from the Venezuelan public, and they're currently held in foreign banks in the, as she calls, the transnational private sector. And she points out that this number, I don't believe it's adjusted for inflation, but this number, 350 billion, is equivalent to 25 times what was invested to rebuild Europe after World War II. So this reminds me of a term that I think you pioneered or you've popularized, gravitization. You talk about how after the U.S. plundered the former Soviet Union and Russia and the former Soviet republics, forcing neoliberal shock therapy, that it wasn't just privatization, it was grabitization. It was grab as much as you can as quickly as you can. I mean, it seems to me that kind of model has been applied to Venezuela with Juan Guaido, the attempt to impose a fake interim government that was never elected. Do you think that it's, that parallel of grabitization is appropriate for Venezuela?
Well, you've seen it very clearly when its gold reserves were seized by the Bank of England and said, America's really the democratic center of the world. And as the democratic center, because we're the democracy, we get to say who's the president of any country in the world. And we found a nasty little opportunist that you just mentioned, and we've decided he's the head of it. And we're giving all of Venezuela's gold supply to him, even though the Venezuelan people didn't elect him. Well, they didn't elect, Chileans didn't elect Pinochet either. Is the democratic center of the world. America gets to designate the heads of any given country by military force where necessary. And so, of course, the gold supply was simply grabbed by England, which again is a small branch of totally dependent on the United States, and grabbed the gold. They grabbed all of Venezuela's holdings of its oil companies, distribution network and gas stations in the United States. And the problem goes back, Venezuela was tied in a knot long before Chavez. And it's when the United States backed a series of dictators ever since Paris Jimenez in the 1950s, who essentially drew up international loan contracts, not only pledging sovereign debt to whoever the bondholders were, but collateralizing Venezuela's debt with all of its oil reserves and all of the holdings of its oil company, including the U.S. Affiliates of all this. And so Venezuela is still suffering from the era of colonialism that America's trying to blame on Chavez and his successors and on socialism instead of on the American assassination teams and killer squads that put in the dictators that pledged all of Venezuela's oil reserves to the foreign bondholders.